Good morning, everyone. I'm, I mean, wow. It's November. Um, it is November, right? Yes. Okay. Confirmation from the rest of the audience here. Thank you so much for being here today at our November Borough Board meeting virtually. Of course, we thank you always for your time. We thank you for just giving what you do to your community, and we are looking forward to working with you as 2020 closes out and 2021 rolls around. Um, Pursuant to Chapter 4, Section 85, and Chapter 69, Section 2706 of the New York City Charter, a joint meeting of the Bronx Borough Service Board, Bronx Borough Service Cabinet, and Bronx Borough Board will take place here virtually Thursday, November 19th, 2020, and starting at approximately 10 a.m. via virtual conference. At this time, we'll take a roll call for attendance. And I'll just announce each community board and office as we go around. And please unmute yourself. I'll try to give you a little time to unmute yourself, and then let us know that you're who it is that you're who that you're actually here, and let me just move on. Community Board 1. You're muted, Chris.
All right. That was a reminder I was trying to give. If you're in WebEx on the computer or a tablet or a phone, you should be able to hit the mute and unmute icon right on the screen. And if you're on the phone only, it's *6 to unmute. So just a reminder for everybody as we go through a roll call.
Yes, and *9 you said to raise your hand. Okay. Did we hear from Community Board 1? Community Board 2?
Cedric is muted.
I'm sorry. Good morning, Madam Deputy.
Good morning.
It's Rafa Acevedo, District Manager. I'm in the office. I'm here with
Roberto Presto, Chairman.
and
Thank you. Excellent. So we got Community Board 1 and 2, Community Board 3.
John Dudley, District Manager, Board 3 is here. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. I was using that background today earlier. I'm glad I changed it. People would think we were in the same place. Community Board 4.
Good morning, Paul Phillips, District Manager, Community Board 4.
Thank you. Community Board 5.
Good morning, Deputy Borough President. Good morning, everybody. This is Ken Brown from Bronx District 5. Thanks.
All righty. Thank you. Community Board 6. Community Board 7.
Hello, Madam Deputy. This is Emmanuel Martinez, Chair CD7. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Community Board 8.
Good morning, Laura Spalter, Chair, Bronx Community Board 8.
Good morning, Kira Gannon, District Manager, Community Board 8.
Okay, Community Board 9.
Good morning, everyone. Shirley San Andres Alonso, Assistant District Manager, CB9.
Very good. Community Board 10. Okay. Community Board 11. And Community Board 12.
Good morning, Madam Deputy Borough President. This is Dr. Michael Burke, Chairman of Community Board 12.
Awesome. Good to see you.
No problem. Thank you. You as well.
Thank you. Good to be seen, as they say. Let's move on to our council representatives. Do we have anyone on from Councilmember Ayala's office? I'm just hearing a bit of feedback. Give me a second, please.
Just a quick note, Deputy Joseph Russo said in the chat that he's here. He was unmuted, but his mic wasn't picking up audio. So just so you know.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I'm going to send him a message on, hopefully we can get that working for him.
Okay. So Community Board 10 is here. Good. Councilmember Cohen's office? Councilmember Jonai's office? And Councilmember Cabrera's office?
Good morning, Greg Faulkner representing Councilman Cabrera.
Awesome. Councilmember Torres?
Good morning, Joseph McManus representing Councilmember Torres.
Thank you. Councilmember Gibson?
Morning.
Okay.
This is Stacy Strong with the Office of Councilmember Vanessa Gibson.
Thank you. Thank you, Stacy. Councilmember Salamanca? And last but not least, Councilmember Diaz Sr. Okay. So we'll move forward with our agenda. So our first presentation is going to be an overview of unified storm water rules, and it will be Ms. Adgate from the Borough of Public Affairs and Communications and New York City Department of Environmental Protection.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. I too am a little shocked that we're almost near the end of November. I feel like the last several weeks have been a bit of a blur. But I'm thankful to be here this morning to talk to you about some upcoming rulemaking that DEP is working on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Attempt to share my screen. And please let me know if you can see this.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So obviously you're all very familiar with DEP and our work, not only with supplying drinking water, but also managing our sewer system with not only sanitary waste, but also stormwater runoff, which we treat at our wastewater treatment plants. And so when new development and redevelopment come to us for a site connection permit or to connect to our sewer system, we have an existing set of rules related to how much stormwater new development needs to store on site before releasing it into the sewer system. But at this point in time, there's some inconsistency between the existing rules that we have on the books. And so the Unified Stormwater Rule, which we are currently developing, really seeks to align existing practices and rules while also prioritizing green infrastructure and sustainable stormwater management which obviously is one of the priorities of the city as we think about resiliency, sewer capacity, and infrastructure, all of the things that are so important for the city of New York now and for the future. And so the draft rule takes into account not only existing policies, but also existing regulations. You may recall that a few years ago, I did several presentations with all of you related to our MS4 system. That's the type of sewer system where there's one pipe for sanitary waste that goes to the treatment plant, and then there's another pipe for stormwater runoff that sends stormwater directly to the waterways of Bronx River, Harlem River, Westchester Creek, and the other waterways that are so important for Bronx communities. And the rules associated with those regulatory requirements were different from the ones for the combined sewer system, which is where there's one pipe that takes both sanitary and stormwater runoff to the plant for treatment. So our goals are to really align those requirements to improve sewer operations, supporting site drainage on new development, and then increasing green space across the city and aligning with the goals of the 2019 Climate Mobilization Act. Let's see, we can't move forward. Here we go. So the rule itself, the current draft, really focuses on two components. One is the existing site and house connection permit requirements. So that's Chapter 31 of our code. And also stormwater construction, which is Chapter 19. So you can see here that for each one of those areas, we're really talking about either stormwater quality or quantity. And where we see these two areas aligning is in the use of green infrastructure. And so that's green roofs, rain gardens, permeable pavers, and really allowing new development and redevelopment to use green infrastructure practices to receive credit for their volume managed. And that's something that just has not yet existed in the code. So by aligning these different portions of code and existing regulations, we really see a lot of benefits for permit applicants who are coming to us. Because right now, if you are building in the city, there are different rules if you are building in an MS4 area versus a combined sewered area. So we're really working to provide more consistency to make it easier for applicants to plan. We're working to simplify and streamline the permit application process in our design and review process. We're allowing a lot more flexibility in design options. And with that, we're currently developing a new design manual to really help engineers, landscape architects, to think creatively about what the uses are on site and what opportunities there are for stormwater management. And then we're providing new formulas. So really working to make it easier for permit applicants to calculate what they need to do in order to comply with our rules. And of course, this has many benefits for the city. As we're requiring this on-site stormwater management, that means improved water quality, reduced urban flooding, because we're lowering that burden on public infrastructure as new development is storing that water on site. That's creating capacity in the existing sewer system while reducing energy demands. And I know many of you have been following our green infrastructure program, which we launched in 2010. And by requiring these types of projects on new development will really be working to achieve the goals of our consent order mandate with the state, which is, managing stormwater runoff so that we see a 1.67 billion gallon per year reduction in combined sewer overflows. And as I mentioned, continuing to increase green space. So there's a lot of benefits for applicants, but more importantly, benefits for the city as these projects continue to go into the ground. So just to talk a little bit about the timeline. Earlier this year, we completed a series of interagency technical workshops. Obviously, our sister agencies, whether it's School Construction Authority or Department of Design and Construction, their work will be impacted by these rule changes. And so we, went through a series of technical workshops with them to get early feedback on what we're thinking. In August, the City Council held a hearing and passed intro number 1851, which is the legislation that gives us the authority to unify the existing rules and to implement this rulemaking across the city. And right now we're currently in the process of finalizing the draft rule for interagency review and kicking off our industry and community stakeholder outreach. So we've been, doing meetings like this one across all the boroughs. About 2 weeks ago, we had a workshop for the general public and our environmental stakeholders. And we'll also be targeting developers, engineers, plumbers, all of those who may be impacted professionally. And really the goal of kicking off the outreach this early is because we know that this information is very technical. We really want to give folks time to adjust to the changes so that they can provide substantive feedback when the rule is officially public in spring 2021, and that's when the CAPA process will kick off. The draft rule will be public, as will our draft design manual, and it will be open to public comment and public review. So we see this as a very iterative process in order to ensure that not only the technical design community, but also the community at large has an opportunity to provide feedback on what we're trying to accomplish, which ultimately is more storage, increased green space, and just more flexibility in the design options as we think about making New York more sustainable and improving water quality. So that is all I have in terms of slides, but I believe that I have time for questions, if that works for you, Deputy Borough President.
Absolutely. Let's see if we have any questions. Please use the raise hand function on the participant list. And then if you're on the phone, you can raise your hand with *9. And of course, let's not forget to unraise your hand with *9 again. Any questions, Chris?
So far, to George Torres. I saw your hand first. So George, go ahead. You just got to unmute yourself.
Hey, how you doing? Sorry I missed the first half of this part. My only question is twofold. You mentioned that these requirements were supposed to be implemented before 2030, but you spoke mostly about new construction. What are we doing to capture older buildings that may not necessarily do this in the future or have work permit or requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for city-owned property, we have our existing green infrastructure program. Many of you are familiar with the rain gardens that we build in the public right-of-way, but we also partner with the School Construction Authority, the New York City Housing Authority, the Parks Department, and other city agencies to build out green roofs, rain gardens, permeable pavers, and storage on site. So that's one component for city-owned property where we, as the city, are able to fund it. For existing private properties, we've really been working to incentivize green infrastructure. We have our existing green infrastructure grant program. We have a few projects that we've done in the Bronx with the Osborne Association and Montefiore Medical Center. But there were a lot of different challenges with the grant implementation. It required a restrictive covenant against the property. And so, not a lot of properties were able to participate. So we've been developing a new private incentive program without as many legal restrictions so that existing private property owners could come to us for funding to retrofit existing property. So it's really private incentives for private property and then DEP funded projects for city owned property.
All right. Next hand I saw Michael Burke. So Michael, we just unmute. There you go.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. I just have a question in regards to component 1, which I think was the waste stream part of your talk. And again, help me out. I'm a little bit new to this. So I think the reason that I have a question regarding that is because the Bronx River runs along, the confines of, Community Board 12. And so for us, obviously, the flow is going downstream. So when we talk about waste stream, I'm assuming that the wastewater is going to be treated before being dumped into the river. That I'm going to assume that's going to happen. Is there any chance of any of that water coming back upstream? Because we're starting to see a revitalization of a lot of the wildlife and so forth and so on. So that was my concern.
Yeah. So as you know, there's been a lot of investment related to improving water quality in Bronx River. And this rule is sort of the next iteration of that. So you might remember that we have a long-term control plan for Bronx River that proposed a project to reduce combined sewer overflows and continue on the ecological gains that you're referring to. But as you know, because our sewer system is so complex and there's so much new development, there's no one size fits all approach. So think of this as in addition to that existing long-term control plan project, which means if there's a new development that's going into the Bronx River watershed, which is primarily a combined sewered area, and that property is connecting to our sewer system, now they have an increased amount of storage that they have to do on their site. So now they're keeping even more flow out of the sewer system, which will even further reduce combined sewer overflows into the Bronx River, even above and beyond our long-term control plan when that's finished.
All right. And one other hand raised is Dr. Nancy Keck from our office, our Director of Health and Human Services. Nancy?
Good morning.
I was waiting for you, Nancy.
No, we are actively monitoring the issues of combined sewer overflow and have an ongoing project in our policy group. But that was not the essence of my question. So it's a little bit closer to home. I live in a community that is plagued by flooding in the public areas and streets. There has been, right now, there's a major infrastructure in place that is building, separations between very ancient and decaying sewers, et cetera. But the streets are where my attention is. We also have a lot of communities, and this is true in other parts of the Bronx, where there are no curbs. There are just gardens, huge green spaces, very large trees, and they absorb water. They allow for extra drainage. And last year, there was a huge campaign to compel homeowners to create concrete, curbs for lack of a better, sidewalks.
So DOT was requiring sidewalks to go in? Okay.
Yes, and a lot of people, even if you had a crack or anything, they were like, okay, you have to completely either create a new pathway or repair the old one, and they did it for you, and then you got many, many thousands of dollars in bills. And there was no opt out. Either you do the work yourself, and so I was encouraged by the fact that you said there was an interagency training and that there was discussion about these things, because I think that's related. If the city and one agency is compelling people to create concrete, non-absorptive, paths around their homes and being charged a lot of money for it, and this is unplanned capital improvements, I think it's important that there was this communication that in some cases that extra green space and green material is really doing the job of absorbing massive amounts of water. So, I don't want you to speak to that necessarily, but to assure us that that is something that may be going on, that discussion is ongoing in the background, because homeowners are really hit hard by that.
Yeah, and this is the first time that I'm hearing about this. And I can say that, we do coordinate with DOT every day, quite frankly, because of our rain garden build out program. So they are certainly familiar with the intentionality of the green infrastructure program to, reduce impervious area and to direct flow into areas where it can infiltrate. So I'm not sure about what other goals or priorities that they might have been trying to go after with a program like this. But I agree with you that I hope that we'll, continue to build upon each other's work so that even when there are new sidewalks going in, let's say, that we can coordinate either on our rain gardens or infiltration basins or other opportunities so that we're collecting flow from that area. And then just to speak to your point about, increased flooding in the communities, that's something that our office takes very seriously. And we're currently working with the Mayor's Office of Resiliency on a stormwater resiliency plan, which will be out in 2021, which really looks specifically at, the flooding caused by stormwater events, rain events, cloud burst, those very intense sort of short spurt rainfalls, so that we can have a better understanding of what the opportunities are to reduce flooding during those events and to, prioritize investment. So it's something that, is close to all of our work to ensure that we're not just talking about stormwater management and common rain events, but also those that, that cause flooding and sort of wreak havoc on neighborhoods.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right. And one other hand is raised, Laura Spalter.
Hi, Mikhail, thank you. You had mentioned permeable pavers. I understand there's also something permeable cement, and considering all the cement areas that are going up new construction, when we suggest this in land use meetings, we get pushback. I believe it's more expensive. Going forward, will that be required? Some kind of permeable, pavers, and again, about the cement.
Yeah. So yeah, we hear that same pushback as well. And so we've had a few pilot projects to test out different types of porous, concrete, permeable pavers, other paving systems that can be designed to let water infiltrate through them. And so we're still collecting data on how those systems are doing, because it's not just the cost for design and installation, it's also the maintenance cost, right? So they can get clogged easily. You have to think about the type of vacuuming system you need to unclog them. But the reason why we've been pursuing those pilots is to make it easier for city agencies to choose them when the opportunity is available. And we've had very successful projects. So I would say that, encouraging and increasing the use of permeable pavements is something that's a part of our total program for green infrastructure. That said, it won't be required for new development. What will be required is that the, project developers manage a certain amount of flow using techniques like that. So they may choose to use porous concrete, but they may also choose to use a rain garden, or they may also choose to do some other type of infiltration technique. So while we're trying to ensure that they can customize the design solutions, porous pavers will definitely be a part of that option. Ultimately, though, however much they're capturing will be the same from our end, whether they do permeable pavers or they do a rain garden. So from our end, I say, us as the public and what flow is going into our sewer system, the storage that they're capturing, the volume of water that they're capturing on site will be the same, whether they do the permeable pavers that you're referring to or another green infrastructure technique.
Thank you, Mikhail. One more comment. The city loves to build on swamps, wetlands, and then doesn't understand why we're flooding like crazy. And you know how billions can be absorbed by a wetland, or so to me, that whole concept of continuing to do that goes against everything the DEP is trying to do. Do you have any influence, in this area of taking a look and saying this is a very important area because it absorbs so much water as is? Don't develop it.
Yeah, so it's actually the State Department of Environmental Conservation, DEC, that regulates wetlands as it relates to development. I will say, though, that I completely agree with you that wetlands are such a critical piece of our ecosystem. And so as an agency, we've been involved in many wetland restoration projects across the city. And we've, partnered with so many environmental organizations to continue to make sure that those go in and those thrive. I think that there's growing insight, particularly in the engineering community, about the challenges that you're referring to when it relates to construction in existing wetlands. But I think that the future is sort of brighter because there's a lot of work to sort of return to more natural systems. But ultimately, the regulations fall under DEC and not DEP.
Thank you so much. Great work.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
All right, so we have two more hands raised now. John Dudley, I saw your hand next. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask you. You mentioned the effort with DEP is to unify the stormwater rules that are currently now inconsistent as it relates to the site connection permit requirements in MS4 areas as opposed to those areas with the combined sewer overflow. Just clarify that for me again, what the MS4 area is related to the, vis-a-vis the CSO.
Yeah.
As it relates to, the purposes to align the rules, but just what is the MS4 again?
So most of the city is served by the combined sewer, including the vast majority of the Bronx. So you've got your one pipe with sanitary waste and stormwater runoff going to the treatment plant. And then, of course, during some rain events, if there's a lot of rain, that pipe overflows, and then you have that mixture of sanitary waste and stormwater discharging into the Bronx River, and that's your combined sewer overflow. The MS4 system was built out primarily in the younger areas of the city. So the vast majority of Staten Island is MS4, Southeast Queens, South Brooklyn, and that's where you have two pipes. So you have one that's taking the sanitary waste to the treatment plant, and the other that's just for stormwater. So that water is going into the system and then discharging directly into the local water body. But of course, it's picking up pollutants along the way, right? If there's trash on the street, if there's construction debris, there's no filter. From a regulatory requirement, the city received its first MS4 permit back in 2015. And in 2018, we released the New York City Stormwater Management Plan, which has a whole host of different programs to reduce the amount of pollutants going into that stormwater system. So in 2017, we worked on new legislation that included construction requirements for new development just in the MS4 system. So that's what created a difference between the existing regulatory requirements, because the MS4 system rules were new and the combined sewer system rules were older. And so now we're bringing them together.
Yeah, so as it relates to MS4 areas, you said the first permit was issued in 2015. So that had to do with site connection permits that were requested from 2015 on. So in other words, would the MS4 areas be areas where permits were issued from 2015?
Not quite, but very close. That permit, that 2015 permit was issued from the state to DEP.
Okay.
As part of the requirements for that permit, we had to come up with rules for new development. Those did not really start going into effect until 2019.
Okay.
2019. So right now, if you're developing in MS4 in an MS4 area, yes, you're coming to us for a permit.
I got you. Lastly, I just want to ask you, for private property owners, you had mentioned there are private incentive programs that are going to help those individuals retrofit.
Yeah.
But is there the funding for that purpose? Is there a legal requirement that those private property owners have to retrofit to store more of that stormwater on site to relieve that burden on the system in and of itself? Is there is there a requirement for existing private property owners?
Yeah, so for the existing grant program, the requirement is that you manage 1 inch of stormwater runoff on your site with the funding that we give you. So we look at, like let's say in the case of the Osborne Association, they applied for funding for a green and blue roof. And so they were required to calculate how much runoff would happen from a 1 inch rainfall, and then build out their green and blue roof to manage that volume. And then that's what the city paid for.
Okay, so that was a funding request related to this improvement.
Exactly.
For the purpose of storage and saving the runoff. But is there a legal requirement that they do that? In other words, they wanted to do it from a green standpoint, right? Is there a legal requirement that the private property owners have to?
Not for existing property, no.
There is no legal requirement.
No.
Thank you. Thank you so much, though. Appreciate it. Okay.
All right, those are all the hands I see. So I believe that's it for questions.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you again for that presentation. We have a bit of a theme going, so we're going to move on to New York City Department of Planning. James Harris, Intergovernmental Liaison, presenting for informational purposes the text amendment regarding zoning for flood resiliency. So, Mr. Harris.
Sorry for the confusion. It'll actually be me presenting. James is joining as well. I think is on the call, but I'll be presenting. Christine Camilleri from Bronx DCP. And I'm actually joined by my colleague Jean Yu, also from our zoning division, who I'd like to allow to say some words. And she'll be joining me, has worked really closely on this proposal, will be joining me for the Q&A that we're hoping to do afterwards.
Thanks, Christine. So can you see the screen and the presentation? I just want to make sure. Okay. So good morning. Thank you all for having us at this time. And thank you to many of you who have been part of this work for the past several years since Hurricane Sandy. Again, my name is Jean Yu, and again, also with us here today is Christine Camilleri, a planner from the DCP Bronx office, who will be going through a very brief overview of what is really a very detailed citywide zoning text amendment. But to give you a quick introduction, Zoning for Coastal Flood Resiliency proposes updates to the zoning resolutions Article 6, Chapter 4, and other related sections. So most of the information is what you have seen before, but if you want to hear more about any of the proposal, we can stay for questions, or you can look at the detailed project summary and the entire annotated zoning text at nyc.gov/ccfr, and we can also follow up on any questions we can answer today. So lastly, what we're asking for is your recommendations for the City Planning Commission about this proposal. This proposal is currently referred out to all 59 community boards, borough boards, and borough presidents. And the City Planning Commission is requesting your official recommendations. So I will now turn it over to Christine. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for that. And good morning, everybody. I hope this is finding you all managing and doing as well as possible. We, I think, were last joined the Bronx Borough Board in March 2009 to share an update on this work, which is a project that's really been 8 years in the making. I think, as Jean already mentioned it, Zoning for Coastal Flood Resiliency is a set of recommendations for a citywide zoning text amendment focused on increasing the safety of New York City's current and future flood-prone building stock. And so, you know, while we are moving through a very different sort of crisis, this work, we're happy to see this work moving forward, as it is also, you know, quite important, as I'm sure you all agree. We are back today because the project was referred out to all 59 community boards, borough presidents, and borough boards in the city as of October 19th. So like Jean mentioned, this is a high-level overview of the proposal to help inform your understanding of it, but we are happy to customize this presentation for your community board and share a more kind of detailed version of it at a future meeting. I've been in touch with, we've been in touch with many of you about doing that already, and I've even, I think, shared some of this at some of your board meetings already. And so I've been happy to continue the conversation in that format. Can you flip the slide, Jean? And so it was actually very helpful to have our colleagues at the Department of Environmental Protection provide their presentation before this, because it's a pretty good segue to this slide, which is really about how our work at DCP fits into the city's overall resiliency strategy. So as an agency, we are focused on resiliency at the building scale. but we acknowledge, and I think it's important to, as a city, that to increase the resiliency of the city as a whole, we have to be tackling, various agencies have to be tackling this issue at different scales simultaneously for, us to move towards, being a more resilient city. So the work that we are sharing today is part of this multi-tiered range of citywide efforts to really tackle this issue at different scales. Like we have many sister agencies we work with quite closely who are more focused on other scales like coastal, strengthening our coastal defenses and infrastructure, engaging in emergency management planning. All of this work is, important, but we are really focused on this specific building scale, which involves really taking a hard look at what our existing building stock's vulnerabilities are as it relates to flood risk, and also what our challenges to resilient construction. This work is all part of the One NYC initiative. Slide, please. Great. And so before moving on and talking more specifically about the proposal, I think it's helpful to talk for a minute about what flood risk in the Bronx really looks like and clarify the geography that this proposal is most directly focused on. What we're looking at is the flood insurance rate map for the Bronx, and it's broken out by community district. This is an area that is determined by FEMA and shown who creates flood insurance rate maps, as you might already be aware of. There's two areas called out. The blue area, which is labeled the 1% annual chance floodplain. I think that's quite a mouthful. It's helpful to think of this blue area as the high risk floodplain. I tend to refer to it that way myself. The green area, which is labeled the 0.2% annual chance floodplain, is helpful to think of as the moderate risk floodplain. We care about both of these areas because we expect that with sea level rise and coastal storms becoming more intense and frequent, that really what is considered moderate risk floodplain today could in fact be tomorrow's high risk floodplain. There's some figures on the left that really kind of give a snapshot of how many buildings are in the Bronx floodplain, both in those two areas, and also, how much land there is in that area. And so we really, the idea here is we anticipate that the amount of land and number of buildings really in the floodplain that are flood risk are expected to increase over time. Slide, please. And I should mention that is the case for the city as a whole. And so DCP has been involved in a lot of work really since 2013 when Sandy hit that really directly informed this proposal. So to recap some of that work, in 2013, the agency introduced temporary emergency zoning rules that were really focused really specifically on rebuilding and recovery, really in the aftermath of that storm. The idea was to help owners of storm damaged properties to rebuild without facing obstacles from zoning. So I think my kind of go-to example of how this played out in the Bronx is a place with a height restriction like City Island, which has a special district and a 35-foot height cap. You could imagine that someone rebuilding their home and having to comply with the Department of Buildings requirements for flood resilient construction could potentially run into a challenge there, being restricted. And so this set of rules really essentially removed that as an obstacle. And this is the set of rules that we actually still have in place today in our zoning, and that we are working to update with the proposal that we are talking about today. And we've always known we would have to update these rules. And so with that in mind, really in the years since the storm and since the adoption of the emergency rules, have been working towards an update. And so in order to inform that update, we've really done a lot of analysis and, studies, but also had a lot of conversations and actually over 2,500 conversations to date with people who live and work in the floodplain, including many of you and your board members and constituents. And all of that work and conversations directly informed, kind of upheld our understanding of the need for this update and also directly informed the recommendations themselves. We know that the 2013 text has some really important provisions that we want to make a permanent part of our zoning, but we also know quite well it didn't go far enough to help reduce damage, help buildings to reduce damage from future coastal flood events, help buildings to be more resilient in the long term by accounting for climate change, or to help building owners to potentially save on long-term flood insurance costs. Slide, please. And so what will this proposal do? That's kind of what brings us to this point. We have 4 overarching goals and essentially a number of very specific recommendations that fall kind of in each of these under each of these goals, which you can kind of think of as buckets. So what I'll do is talk through some of the examples of the recommendations that kind of fall beneath each of these that are most directly applicable to the Bronx overall. Slide, please. And so the next few recommendations tie in most directly to the first goal, which is to encourage resiliency throughout the city's both current and future floodplains. This is about really moving away from the focus of the emergency text was, which was recovery, and kind of move more towards encouraging proactive retrofits and construction that takes into account future risk. Slide, please. And so we have a lot of optional provisions in zoning today that provide flexibility, zoning relief in the event that someone is retrofitting a building or building a new building in the floodplain. These rules today are only available in that high risk area, that 1% annual chance floodplain. So if you are a building owner in that moderate risk floodplain or are constructing a new building in that area and you want to utilize these rules to account for future risk, you cannot today. And so with this proposal, we are seeking to expand the applicability of those rules, the availability of those rules to the moderate risk floodplain as well. And more specifically, this proposal would expand the applicability of the current text to a broader set of buildings that could also be exposed to future flooding. And what we're doing with this is allowing any lot located in both the 1% or and 0.2% annual chance floodplains to have access to the proposed special rules. One note on this is, part of the consideration here is actually half of the moderate risk floodplain actually did flood during Sandy. And so that area, isn't required to build to a higher standard. We are just looking to make it possible for buildings to do that, kind of in taking into account, I was saying earlier, flood risk tomorrow, but, in some ways that risk is already here in this area. Next slide. And so this goal, goal number 2, support long-term resilient design of all building types, really kind of speaks to the reality of our floodplain as a city, and this is true for the Bronx as well, which is that our floodplain is largely developed. There's not a whole lot of vacant land, and along with that, there are a lot of different types of buildings, and some of them more difficult to retrofit or construct resiliently than others. So this kind of makes it so that it's very important that we think about all of these types of buildings when we write zoning rules, because we don't want a specific type of building to be excluded from this framework. This is one of these lessons learned from Hurricane Sandy. For instance, attached buildings weren't given enough relief with the current text. And so we've been looking to kind of broaden the types of buildings that we are really specifically accounting for. Next slide. And so this proposal would make it possible for optional, and I'll kind of underscore that, optional zoning regulations that would allow building owners to physically elevate habitable spaces and other critical building support features above projected flood elevations in a more standardized way. Essentially, the idea here is to allow for the same size building to be constructed on a particular lot, but out of harm's way. Providing more flexible zoning envelopes also means that a building can account for future flood risk and potentially recoup lost floor area. So, you know, if you're going to lose a portion of your house, like a basement, there potentially is another area. You could potentially relocate that above protected flood elevations. Next slide. And so this slide, the next one actually pertains to situations where neighborhoods and buildings do not fully comply with zoning today, and also just kind of more unique situations, which we certainly have a lot of. In the Bronx, we have in the floodplain in community districts 10 and 9, kind of historic bungalow communities, buildings, homes built on small lots, like in Harding Park and Edgewater Park, that could really face a lot of challenges in undertaking resiliency improvements. And so the 2013 text actually did include specific provisions for lots that were small, narrow, or shallow, but these rules weren't actually made available citywide. They were only made available in certain neighborhoods. The cottage envelope is really a specific provision that we got a lot of positive feedback on in other parts of the city. That is an optional envelope that would allow for additional side yard relief that would, on these small lots, essentially what that would do is allow for a kind of shorter, wider building that could take into account flood resilient construction standards. You know, in the absence of that, you can end up in some of these neighborhoods with what is a very tall, narrow building that doesn't quite doesn't have a great internal layout as far as habitability, and also can be quite kind of at odds with the context of the surrounding neighborhood. And so making this envelope available citywide is part of this proposal. Next slide. And so last kind of in this bucket of recommendations, with such a vast and diverse building stock in the floodplain, we realize that and recognize that not every type of building in all situations would necessarily be helped by our as of right rules, no matter how hard we try. So the proposal, this proposal would continue to offer discretionary pathways for these sorts of unique circumstances. The pathway would be through BSA special permits to ensure that we're really kind of covering our bases as far as offering pathways in all unique situations, allowing buildings a way of meeting the standards for construction in the floodplain. Next slide. And our third goal is to allow for adaptation over time through incremental retrofits. So we know quite well that it isn't always practical or feasible or even required for a building to be fully retrofitted. But at the same time, there are other sorts of strategies that can be employed in making that building safer, even if it can't be fully retrofitted. And so we don't want zoning to stand in the way of those strategies either. Next slide. And so pictured on this slide is a campus housing development, something we don't have a ton of in the Bronx, but there are some places where these sorts of buildings are in the moderate risk floodplain. These are notoriously difficult to retrofit fully types of buildings. And so that being said, they still have options that could be pursued to be made safer. For instance, raising mechanicals on raised platforms or relocating them to a roof. We are looking into, with this proposal, clarifying the rules that we have for permitted obstructions so that these sorts of features can be exempted from floor area calculations. This is an issue that we heard a lot about during the outreach process and heard a lot of support for. Next slide. And I think buildings used for manufacturing and industrial uses definitely also kind of fit into that difficult to retrofit category, difficult to retrofit fully, I should say. And so with this proposal, we are also including floor area exemptions that could make it possible to incorporate something like a raised mezzanine within a business to raise critical building equipment out of harm's way. This is a recommendation that came out of a study we did called the Resilient Industry Study that was really specifically focused on the sorts of challenges that industrial businesses face in trying to make their buildings safer, and this is a very kind of cost-effective workaround in the case that you have a large masonry building that can't necessarily accommodate these other measures that you may be familiar with. Next slide. And our final goal, which is a little bit different from the previous regulations, in that they show this category would actually apply on a citywide level, and so facilitating future recovery by reducing regulatory obstacles. This is really about kind of moving towards having a set of rules, really emergency break glass rules ready to go that could assist with the reconstruction of damaged buildings after a future storm or type of emergency, including the current pandemic, that could be readily available to help expedite the city's response and recovery. This is not something that we had when Hurricane Sandy hit, and I think it really hurt us and slowed down the recovery process. And so we want these rules kind of ready to go for the next emergency. Next slide. Sandy showed us how a storm's effects can go far beyond the floodplain, especially across our energy grid. And this proposal would allow power systems to be considered, a range of power systems to be considered permitted obstructions in all open areas across all zoning districts to help facilitate their installment. Next slide. In addition, to ensure that all areas of the city can easily provide ADA access, the proposal would clarify or classify both ramps and lifts as permitted obstructions in all open areas as well. And the idea here is just to facilitate more accessible building design overall. Next slide. This proposal includes some rules that would limit the construction of nursing homes in high-risk areas. The idea here is to lessen the health consequences and logistical challenges of evacuating the residents of these facilities, which really face kind of specific challenges in that they are required to provide kind of continuous care. I'll note in the Bronx, there's two specific areas where this rule would apply. That is to the west of the major Deegan, in an area that actually cuts across community boards 5 and 7, and all of City Island is one of these areas. The proposal would prohibit the development of new nursing homes in these areas and slightly restrict their the enlargement of existing facilities, and in these specific geographies and within the 1% annual chance floodplain. And part of the thinking here is that these areas are likely to have limited vehicular access in the event of a storm, could pose challenges for evacuation. Next slide. And so we, as we're well aware and are experiencing right now, disasters arrive in all forms. And rather than rewriting our emergency provisions every time a new crisis strikes, this proposal would place recovery provisions in the zoning resolution so they can be quickly selected based on the issues posed by a given emergency. And the provisions would include things like cutting down on red tape and paperwork that might be required during the building permitting process, and also allowing additional time for an affected grandfathered business to reopen. Next slide. And so I think as Jean mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, this is as a citywide zoning text amendment. This proposal has been referred to all community boards, borough presidents, borough boards in the city. We are currently in the 60-day review period for this proposal that began on October 19th and are actively seeking recommendations. We really, there's varying applicability of the proposal of the provisions themselves, but as I mentioned, the last few, those emergency rules do apply citywide and beyond the floodplain. And so we do welcome recommendations on all of these rules. I think at this point I will pause for questions, but after that review period is complete, it will move on to the City Planning Commission and City Council for review, as you can see here. Happy to take questions now if we have time for that, and I'll invite my colleague Jean to chime in.
So we do have time for questions. We'll take questions now. *9 if you're on the phone to raise your hand, and in the participant link or tab, you can raise your hand there. Chris, do we have any hands up?
So far, one, Joe McManus. So Joe, if you just unmute yourself, go ahead.
Yeah, the only thing that I haven't heard you talk about is the utilities. Now, during Sandy, when some of these tunnels were flooded, the salt water really destroyed the electric, because most electric systems are not resilient to salt water. I mean, domestic water and sewers are, because they're different materials. So is there any thought to change those rules?
Yeah, so that's a really excellent point. And I think that, we definitely have colleagues, at our sister agencies that are more involved in being focused on that work. But I will say that actually is exactly part of the rationale behind, thank you, Jean, for pulling this up, providing more flexibility at the building scale for backup power systems. I think as far as the infrastructure piece, like kind of understanding, and having seen a lot of our kind of larger scale infrastructure fail, what we can do, being that this proposal is focused on building scale resiliency, is provide flexibility so that we can have backup systems, kind of on site. I think I'd have to, I think a lot of our sister agencies, as coordinated by the Mayor's Office of Resiliency, are definitely more focused on looking at infrastructure specifically and make investments to make those systems more flood prone and kind of build upon lessons learned, like you just mentioned.
Yeah, the only reason I asked that, because during Sandy, I had no problem with flooding, but the electricity went out.
That's right.
And I was a construction worker for 50 years, and I know this. The electric, we did piping, so everything is waterproof. The water goes in. It's in. If it's not out, it's on the outside. It can't get in.
Yeah.
But electric, mostly aluminum, and even though it's screwed together, it's not watertight. So that's why I asked the question.
Definitely. I think a lot of people had that experience. I could say I did too. But thank you for asking that.
All right, Laura Spalter has her hand raised. Laura, go ahead. And unmute yourself before you do.
Okay, I'm good. Will retrofitting be required under the new text? And if so, is there a timeline on this?
Great question. No, these are optional provisions across the board. Building code, which I didn't speak to in any detail. There is a section of building code that DOB is responsible for managing that is called Appendix G that applies to newly constructed or significantly improved or significantly altered buildings in the floodplain. But those are that's new construction. Thank you, Jean. I have this kind of appendix slide that breaks down the requirements for newly constructed or the building code requirements for new buildings and these substantially improved buildings. But our provisions are all optional, and there's no requirement for existing buildings to retrofit. We just want to encourage, don't want zoning to stand in the way if that's something that is an option.
Thank you. I have one more question. How will, or do you foresee applications to BSA be different because of this text amendment? Will the BSA responses be different? Will the findings change? Will more developers go to this text as reasons for BSA variances, or the text is going to alleviate that need? I'm just you had mentioned something quickly about the relationship with BSA, and I would appreciate some clarity.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think that we anticipate kind of a huge surge of BSA applications, related to this. This is actually something we currently have in place. And Jean, feel free to kind of elaborate on what I'm saying, but this is actually something we already do, and we haven't seen that. And so this would actually just be kind of continuing that option. And it's really a small, like this is the pathway for really a very small number of buildings. I think kind of consider relative to the buildings we have in the floodplain. It's really specifically these sorts of buildings that don't get relief in one of these other ways that have kind of specific nonconformances. So I don't think we anticipate, like this huge kind of surge of these sorts of applications. Jean, anything you would add to that regarding the discretionary pathways and the findings?
Sure. So just as Christine mentioned, this is really a pathway for kind of any building to be able to flood-proof. So again, understanding that the flexibilities that we're trying to provide for everyone may not work for every kind of unique situation, as Christine mentioned. We have been working very closely with the BSA on the special permit. So currently they have, sorry for my voice, but they have a very kind of limited set of rules that they can modify in the current underlying regulations and in the 6400 where the zoning for floodplain applies. I guess from all of the case studies we've heard and the cases and applications that have gone through, they recommended that we just need a little bit more flexibility. So for example, in the current BSA special permit, we don't really have any way of the BSA to modify floor area. So allowing that, and also with height, it was very limited in the current text that we have. So we're just giving just a little bit more flexibility for that as well. But yes, so we are making a few modifications, but again, we have been working closely with the BSA for this, but you will be able to find the details for all of this in the annotated text on the website of all of these changes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Chris?
No other hands raised at this time, so
Okay.
seems like
Awesome.
we're good.
Good. So we'll go to our Director of Health, Dr. Nancy Keck. She's going to give us an overview or more so a COVID update. I see she's muted, maybe.
I muted myself. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, and I'm just gonna get that presentation up here in a minute for you, Nancy.
Thank you very much. I took so many notes on the flooding and the last presentation that I have to like purposely shift gears now because it's very fascinating and it really impacts where I live, my home, my neighbors. It's extraordinary. Thank you. I want to say to the last presenter, thanks so much. All right. So the last time I saw all of you and gave a presentation on COVID and health issues in the Bronx was back at the end of July. A lot of time has passed since then. And at that time, we were at a point where the pandemic was waning and, it was summer and we sort of exhaled a little bit. And I think we are now back to paying close and focused attention. The city and state have resumed their updates, not only written, but in teleconferences, and I will be forward feeding that information to everyone in our staff office and through Tom to all of you. Next slide, please. So as you know, all of my updates begin with data from the New York State Department of Health website. It's a familiar looking page. It gives you sort of the big picture, and then you can drill down to the local level. If you look on the left panel, that's statewide data. Over 17 million people have been tested. And then the daily test numbers, hundreds of thousands of people get tested daily. And then you go down and you look at what's happening in the Bronx. For those of you who are looking at this for the first time, potentially, or haven't been with us before, if you see the map, generally the darker the image, the higher the caseload. As always, downstate is always plagued by much higher concentrated cases. And even though there are hotspots throughout New York State, we generally are an epicenter within the state for increasing COVID cases. In July, it is of interest that at that date, on the 23rd, when we last met to discuss this, it was 49,000 cases. And our rate of positive cases for the number of people that were tested was 11.5%, was significant. In retrospect, we have come an incredibly long way. So as of yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I created these slides yesterday or updated them. If you look at the total number of people tested in the Bronx is well over 1,162,000, 59,548 people so far have been positive. This is overall in the Bronx. And then the way they calculate the percent positive results is for people tested on a particular day and the number of new positives on that day. So currently, when they do new COVID tests, we are now at 5.1%. That's how they arrive at that data. Next slide, please. So when you go to the New York City site, they also show you very interesting data. Actually, I like the old familiar New York State site. It's like an old friend. You know where to go. You always know where to find the information you need. New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene really has evolved their site, and on a cyclical basis, they update the way that they represent information. It's challenging, but it's also fascinating because I think that they've really done an amazing job in the way that they are showing in a way to be transparent and to make information accessible and clear and easy to understand. So this is recently, I just pulled this up, where they show you across boroughs, both age and ethnicity and male-female distribution. And even if you are not a scientist and you really want to understand what this all means, if you look at the lighter colors, the yellow colors are very low case rates. And as you get towards the dark purple, those are areas of very high concentration of positive cases. What's of interest to note there is the other thing that's important is the way that public health data is shown. They don't show you always raw numbers. Raw numbers are important, but it's more important to take those raw numbers and divide it by the population, the actual number of people that live in a borough or wherever you're measuring, and that's what's called cases per capita. So the data here are shown in that way, taking account for the size of the population versus the size of the problem. And what you'll see is it's not a good distinction for the Bronx, but we actually lead in COVID cases when you look at per capita, per 100,000 people. It's 4,113 cases per 100,000 is right where we are now. Even though the other boroughs are having epicenters, hotspots, and rapidly escalating rates, we have consistently been in the top position. So moving on, next slide, please. All right. So what I wanted to impress upon everyone here is how testing has really changed the landscape for us. If you look at this shows from the New York State site, again, the old familiar yellow and gold and blue graphics from April or March, April, all the way to present. The rate of testing has just increased by orders of magnitude. We used to have hundreds of people tested per day, and now we are talking hundreds of thousands of people per day. And that has really made a huge difference. That is what has allowed our curve to actually, taper off and really be at baseline, and why our state has been at the very bottom of nationwide cases for a long time, for many months. Very aggressive strategies with testing. Next slide, please. This is how the city, if you remove the testing information, all that blue stuff, and you focus just on the number of cases, looking at on the left, this is New York City overall over the same period of time. So from March, April, from the apex, which is the tip of that curve, all the way through the summer and going now to the present in the beginning of November. What you can see is that incredibly, flattened curve. And then there's a slight uptick. Now, that's where we currently are. That's why schools closed as of today. And that's why there is extra caution and extra testing and lots of other things that are being put into place by the Department of Health at the city and state level to really nip these surges as early and as aggressively as possible. What's important, and I know I may be repeating myself, I still feel like it's my duty to tell all of you, all of these surges are really preventable, because the things that has kept us at these low levels, aside from spending more time outdoors, has really been that people wearing masks, doing hand hygiene, maintaining distance, and really avoiding crowding and situations where you are going to be crowded and also have your guard down and remove your masks. All of those things really matter. They have a tremendous impact. So before we get off that slide, I want you to look at on the upper right quadrant, there's Bronx at the top. That little up curve that you see at the very end that's from just the last few days where we've broken the threshold of 3% positive testing rate. I think by the time we see you again, that curve may go from something like this to something that is incredibly acute and indicating a sharp increase. We are at that point. It doesn't have to be that way. I think the messaging can be improved, and the sort of health literacy and public education can be improved. We are working diligently on doing that so that we can really let people know they can be an active participant in preventing infection and spread. And it's not about compliance, it's about taking care of oneself. So not to preach, but I want to be sure that I am telling everyone, The public messaging around this is very crucial. And more importantly, as community leaders, all of you, all of us are in some leadership role, and it is vital to be able to talk to your constituents about this. Next slide, please. The most important thing that I wanted to bring to your attention, and this is probably the slide that should leave the most lasting impression for all of us in the Bronx. Every chance I get, every time the borough president gives a talk or goes into a community or any presentations that any of us give, we always go to these data portals and we put together the information to really look at trends, to look at important information that informs us as to what's happening in our borough. And if you look, every single day we get the data that shows you how many people have been tested, how many are positive, and what the percentage is. And a lot of people really focus on the percentages. And certainly the way that the Department of Health acknowledges when there is a hotspot that is in danger and that is growing and turns from, yellow to orange to red, it's because they look at daily testing rate. I am interested in the blue, if you notice, between Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens, they are testing in very high numbers on a daily basis. Okay, that was yesterday's testing data or the day before. Look at the Bronx. Half. We are testing literally at half the rate as all the other boroughs, except for Staten Island, which is a bit of an outlier, given their size and population. So that's important. That's crucial. I want everyone to really think about that. Why is that happening? Those are the kinds of really challenging questions that we do not necessarily have direct answers for. Public health officials are really looking closely, but there's a couple of things that we all should know. There is no shortage of testing sites. We have many, many, many testing sites. Every urgent care center, private offices, clinics, community-based organizations, churches, you name it. There are places, there are pop-up tents, mobile sites, rapid testing sites. We have a lot of opportunities for people to get tested. And yet people do not avail themselves of that. And so, it's important to really think that through and figure out in our messaging, how do we encourage people to get tested and to do it frequently, not just once and say, oh, I'm okay, because the risk exists every time you leave the house to go to work. And that's an important factor. So there are working issues, there are crowded places, there are long lines in places to get tested. But at some of the facilities, like in the health and hospitals facilities, there are very few lines. You can get in there, you can get tested and be out and have an answer within a day. And you can do that regularly, particularly if you are in a job that is very public facing, you are an essential worker or in healthcare. That's critical. You may get tested at work, but recently we found that no, not everyone who does work in frontline jobs actually gets tested regularly. So next slide, please. I think it's important for us to really push on that issue. In addition to that, when you are looking, and we are all being citizen scientists and we go and we look up what's going on in our communities, that's critical. It's essential to really figure out what's your personal risk. If you look at your zip code and you can pretty much see what the infection rate is, how many cases, how many deaths, I would like everyone to do that. Look at your zip code, see what is happening in your community. From these maps, again, you don't even need to see the numbers, but I did extract them and put them in a table below. The top areas that have the highest case rates and the highest death rates have pretty much remained consistent. 10469 leads the pack. It always has from the very beginning, from March and April, and we know that it's a middle-class neighborhood where there's a ton of people who are healthcare workers, frontline people, essential workers. And so they have had high risk and unfortunately also the highest death rate in the entire borough. And working downward from there, you can see what the others are. If you, just for comparison, those really sort of purplish black areas are in Queens. They are those communities like Corona and East Elmhurst. For comparison, let's say in Corona, which was considered the other epicenter in New York City, they had in excess of 5,600 cases. They're pushing towards 6,000. And over, I think, 500 and something deaths. But it's critical. That's how you can really understand within the community you live in what your risk is. Can I have the next slide, please? Given that, as of yesterday, the city has now, for the first time ever, indicated that there are 2 Bronx cluster zones. They are not like in the other boroughs where you have little tiny neighborhoods, but rather they are large swaths of yellow that cover many neighborhoods. One of them is on the western side, and the other one is the northeast corridor. And you can see this on the New York City Department of Health website, but it covers quite an expanse. What that means is that the cases in those areas, this is a precautionary area now, and we are having very heightened number of cases. People need to increase testing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Aside from the fact, I think there's something important to mention. It is not all gloom and doom. The important thing is that even though cases are surging, the number of deaths have really leveled out. And part of that is the aggressive testing. And for people, once you know that you're positive, to remove yourself from the population and to seek medical care and treatment. Because in the early months of this pandemic, we now have hindsight of what happened back then and how people got incredibly sick, really sick at home on their own before they actually went to the hospital. And they got there late and they got treatment late. And in this case, we have experienced this before, and I think this slide is focused on the death rate, who has died in the past. A lot of very useful information has come forward from 9 months of public health review of the data. Some things have not changed. I think we are in our borough. We are pushing between the confirmed and the presumptive cases, in excess of 5,000 people have perished in the Bronx. And if you look on the right of those confirmed deaths, as we anticipated because of the demographics of our borough, it is predominantly Black and brown people who are an older population that have really lost lives here. That is important and crucial. If we go to the next slide. What's important here, again, is that in retrospect, having looked at all the people who did die from COVID and presumptive COVID and conditions that really made them vulnerable, a very, very, very significant proportion of them really had chronic illnesses and conditions that made them vulnerable. And it explains a lot of things about health disparities in our borough. And it's important, critically important, for individuals who have these underlying conditions, whether it's lung disease, asthma, heart issues, cardiovascular disease, weakened immune system, etc. You can see what those conditions are. Those people absolutely, crucially need to get tested, and regularly, and so do the family members that live with them. So next slide, please. With that said, I would like all of you to be incredibly diligent in spreading information about where testing is available, what kind of testing is available, and there's lots of flexibility. So, not only do all the hospitals provide testings, and many different clinics and houses of faith and community centers and libraries and postal stations, there are also public sites, mobile sites, and they are in tents, and they are in some of these community-based, places where people get food and other things. And most importantly, they offer antibody testing, they offer rapid testing, in addition to the really high fidelity testing. In some cases, they do it in tandem. In one nostril, they'll give you the rapid test, which is about 80% accurate and may or may not give you a false positive or negative. But then in the other nostril, they send off to the lab the really high fidelity tests that look at DNA presence. And in those cases, within a day or two, you have a solid answer. Between those two tests, you got a 99.999% answer of whether you're, have been in contact with COVID or not. Even if you're asymptomatic, that's a very important reason to take a test regardless, so that you are not the person who is spreading that within your family, and particularly to people who are vulnerable in your family. That's it. If we go to the next slide, I want to just shift gears for one moment, because every other day there is a new announcement and a new vaccine and a new discussion, and there are trials. You're waving to me? No? Okay, I thought I saw a signal there. I wanted everyone to just have a very simple overview of what is happening. There are a number of contenders. There are 6 vaccine therapies that are actually really at the end of the line for their phase of testing where they can be administered. And in the Bronx, we are testing a number of them. So I want to really let everybody know what that is, what's going on, what that means, and when any of us can really expect access to those vaccines. Next slide, please. So everywhere, when you hear in the news, they all talking about clinical studies. The details of them are not really crucial. What's important is that there's a huge amount of misinformation, some of it coming from very high up in our government, some of it locally, some of it from your friends and neighbors. I think it's important. I've tried to find and identify sites where anyone can go, and whether it's your 5-year-old or your grandmother, they can understand some really fundamental things about how studies are done, how viruses work, and how vaccines are really being targeted to coronavirus. Very basically, almost all of the vaccines that are available now have gone through the first 3 phases, or are wrapping up phase 3 of the clinical trials. At the very beginning, they get a very small number of people and they're testing for safety. When they move into the second phase, they're looking at dosing, they're looking at how often you have to take it, they're looking for adverse effects. When you get to the end of those, they're really looking at if there are any side effects, whether they're going to continue. By the time phase 3 clinical studies happen and people are in very, very large numbers taking those vaccines or a placebo, at that point, it is understood that for the most part, there are very safe, if not minor side effects. Generally, clinical studies don't move forward if there are significant side effects, even if the drug is very beneficial. And no one has reached phase 4 yet. What's important is that with all of the misinformation that is out there, many people are afraid of using vaccines. And I really want to make sure that we're all clear that this is not new. We have been using vaccines for over a century, and we have literally removed very deadly diseases from human populations through the use of vaccines. And the only thing that is really different now is how they are delivered into the human body. Okay, so moving on, I want to give you a couple more small details. You may or may not, feel that they are necessary level of information, but I would like everyone to know. Next slide, please. At the most basic level, I just wanted to indicate that almost every vaccine is targeting, this is on the right, is a beautiful image of the coronavirus. And those little spikes on the outside of it, those are the ones that are really being targeted by every vaccine. Those are parts of that virus that actually allow it to get into human cells through lock and key mechanisms. And once they infect you, they replicate, and you could have anywhere from no symptoms to very severe illness. Now, the manufacturers of vaccines have now gotten very creative. They no longer just take like a small piece of the virus and introduce it into a vehicle to create antibodies, but they now are using genes that signal your own cells and the DNA in your body to make proteins. Now we are really targeting the latest advances in this technology is that we are now, without ever having been exposed to the virus, telling our own cells to be able to manufacture some of these spike proteins. And then our immune system goes, wait a minute, they recognize it, they're able to target it and destroy those proteins. That is an important process. That's what this whole business is revolving around. The spike proteins themselves can be blocked in many ways. There are different ways of giving vaccine. And so I'm not going to bore you with tremendous detail, but I did give some good references that lay people can actually look at, read images to really understand that if you're going to eventually try or enroll in a trial or take a vaccine, what is actually happening. Next slide, please. So there are some great references here. I particularly like the one in the Wall Street Journal. There's a little video that goes with it that not only tells you what are the vaccines, but also what are the treatments. Let's say you get COVID and you haven't been lucky enough to have a vaccine. What are the treatments and how do they work and are they safe? There's a great overview. And then there are some other descriptions of the current vaccine candidates, the 6 that we may or may not see after January in this population and how they work. I'm not going to bore you with this. We've had so many great presentations, but just so that you know, the vaccines are either injecting genes or signals to make your own genes manufacture something. They also can have a piece of the actual virus itself, a small piece of it that then causes an immune response. And my personal favorite are where you use a viral vector. And this one in particular is like a little Trojan horse. You take a virus like a common cold virus and you insert a signal into that. And once you that gets into your cells, your body then starts the immune process that we described. And lastly, the technology which takes the longest in this case, and none of the manufacturers of antibodies themselves, there are a number of companies like Regeneron and other that are manufacturing what are called monoclonal antibodies. They actually are providing you with an instant immunity once you are injected with those antibodies, rather than your body manufacturing themselves. This is the strategy that they're using. So the final word on that is, I wanted to let you know that one of the vaccine trials, I signed up for one yesterday, as did 2 members of my family and some of my neighbors here, particularly as they are older neighbors in their 60s and 70s. And we all signed up at Montefiore. Montefiore is testing a vaccine that comes from AstraZeneca and Oxford University. And that is the one that uses a viral vector. They take a common cold virus and they have modified it so that it can boost your immune system to recognize the spike proteins of coronavirus. At Jacobi Hospital, they are organizing trials for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That is also a really excellent option. I would like everyone to know that if they want information, I'm happy to provide that. There is also like a national portal for people who want to volunteer. What's important is for most of us, we will not really see access or have access to a vaccine for many, many, many months, up until spring or summer of next year. And that's even if we choose to get one. But options exist, particularly if you are in a vulnerable population. And I think it's important to be informed. And the more knowledge you have, the more power you have to determine a path that's right for yourself. That's it. My next slide is to let you know that we have some other ongoing projects, one of which is next Monday, and it is a continuation of a series that we did on food justice in the Bronx. Part 1 was back in mid-October, my apologies. And we recognized all of the urban farms and community gardens throughout the Bronx that really, rose up to feed families that became food insecure throughout the COVID pandemic. They grew thousands and thousands of extra fruits and vegetables in order to give them to pantries, and we recognized the people who were really heroes in doing that. And our next event is really a focused discussion, a community conversation that looks at food policies what has been, how we have fed people through, emergency programs, and really what does the future hold for us? How can we change that so that there's equity in the way people can access fresh and nutritious food? So that promises to be absolutely excellent. Very last slide is to remind everyone that there is a World AIDS Day. And throughout that whole week, a number of community organizations and healthcare organizations are celebrating and having events. In particular, it's to remind us that many years ago, HIV was a deadly illness. Now it is a chronic illness, and it's really been through intensive community effort, healthcare, public-private partnerships, and much advancement in medical treatments that has made this something in the past. We will also pass through COVID. I want people to remember that and to be safe, and not only yourself, but for the sake of everyone that you love. Thank you very much. I'm open for questions. I hope I can answer them.
Thank you, Nancy. The same procedures as before, *9 for if you're on the phone and you want to raise your hand, and then also as usual, raise your hand through the participant tab. At this time, do we have any questions for Nancy?
Yeah, so there's a few hands raised. Just in the order that they're appearing. Michael Burke, I see yours first. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Keck, for that wonderful presentation. I technically have 3 questions, but I'm going to actually do 2 of my questions in one. So the first is the following. I noticed that in the Bronx, we had the highest propensity of positives throughout the entire city. Would you attribute that due to the close quarters or the close living quarters that most of the residents of the Bronx live in? So for instance, the only housing that we have that are freestanding are either in Riverdale, I would say City Island, and parts of our district in the Williamsbridge area. That's question one. Question two is that with the vaccines that are under consideration in the world and in the US, are any of those vaccines that are being developed using epigenetics as a consideration to developing that particular vaccine?
Okay, I will tell you to your first question, I do not know the answer because it is not, I have not really delved into. There are over 200 candidates worldwide, some of which are way ahead of us because, for example, in China, they already are giving vaccines throughout their country. They've developed their own using similar mechanisms to the ones that are competing for the big market share here. So I cannot say, but to your first question, it's actually quite interesting. If you were to look, the borough president has many times gone to community events that are at or near 10469. And if you actually know some of that neighborhood, it is a middle-class neighborhood. There are lots of houses there, small houses. There's not like this massive concentration of huge buildings or public housing. So it seems in particular that even though there is risk if you live in an elevated building and you're not masked all the time, I think for all of us, we should, except for outside of our home, really be wearing masks. And if you're outside riding a bicycle or something, I think that is becoming less and less of a factor. And also, if you look at rural communities in Florida and places where those high rises are not around. It's like a bunch of low bungalows, and people are still getting sick in incredibly high numbers. And we are actually quite fortunate. Somewhere in here, I put in the presentation, we are still the 3rd lowest COVID rate in the entire nation, other than Vermont and Maine. So, I mean, that's been through aggressive management of our, state government. And as much as we may or may not like it, we have complied, and that has really paid off. And in other areas, in other states where people are really big on, their civil rights and their desire to, their civil liberties, I want to say, their desire to make a choice not to wear masks, that's where there have been these like crazy surges now. They are now where we were back in April and May. And so I feel like our path through part 2 of COVID 2020 will be an easier one because we've been there and we've seen. And I think that some of the factors that really were important in the communities that have the very highest rates is that these are places where we have essential workers, people who cannot not go to work, people who cannot work from home. They are driving people, they are taking care of people in nursing homes, in hospitals, in clinics, they are doing all, restaurant work, they're driving cabs, they're, government workers. They do not have a choice. They go to work, and because of that nature of their work, they have greater exposure.
And that's probably what 10469, I can definitely say, is probably what you have with
Yes.
that. And to your point with the houses, if I can just slip in my last question, with the viral vector vaccine, is it possible that they're using CRISPR technology to modify that virus?
Yes, they're cleaving in genes. They're taking genes to part of the protein code of those protein spikes, and they're inserting it into a very innocuous virus. So something that has been weakened and that is not going to get sick. I think that I personally chose to participate in that trial because I think that is an incredibly safe thing to do. And I think I should also admit that the third of the people in the participating in that trial at Montefiore will get a placebo. That means you get nothing. You will go through the motions like everyone else, and you will not know, are you getting, but 2/3 are gonna, so it's a 2-to-1 ratio. 2/3 of those people are gonna get the actual vaccine, and they will get tested regularly. And if, in fact, you wind up with any symptoms of any kind, you will have a beeline to the hospital and receive care, and also receive very good therapeutics because you have done, a duty to your community. I think that's an important thing. Thank you. Thank you for asking.
No problem.
All right, we've got a few other hands raised. George Torres, I see you're next, so go ahead.
Thank you, Chris. Good to see you, Dr. Nancy. It's been quite some time. My question is, the last time that you were here, we spoke about the mode of transmission. At that point, we didn't know yet if it was being aerosolized. And my question, I guess, revolves around that. And I should state before all of that, Community Board 12 is a testing site. So if anybody wants to get tested, they can come to our office. The back in our carriage house has been converted into a health and hospitals testing site. So, and it's rather quick. I've gotten tested there myself as well. My question is, this second wave, I've heard Dr. Fauci ask say that it's not necessarily a second wave, it's still a continuation of the first wave.
Right.
What is the expectation? Because my fear is that people have become, lackadaisical with like you said before, with the mask wearing. And there's an inconsistency in the government response. Yesterday, the mayor closed schools, yet gyms and restaurants are still open. And you noted in your presentation that, the second wave is coming because of indoor transmission. Is that still the case? I mean, do we know more about the mode of transmission? Are we in the first or in the second wave? And what are the expectations going forward?
I think you are right. There is an upsurge. It is not necessarily a second wave, but for most of us who really let our guard down over the summer and spent a lot of time outdoors, we did not really focus on, what would happen when it got really cold and we all came indoors. And yes, to your question, many businesses, many buildings have made modifications to their ventilation systems, and the answer is everything that is spread through, the saliva molecules and sneezing and all that all becomes aerosolized, and that's why the position of all physicians and health experts has been masking not only protects you, it protects everyone around you. And that's why it's essential that it's this global thing. It's not, do you want to choose to wear one? It should be mandated. And I believe that after January 20th, that's exactly going to be the first thing that's going to happen, is that everyone have to wear masks. And that is probably one of the single most important strategies to reduce the infection rate. and get everything under control. It's critical. To your second question, which was my apologies.
Well, is the second wave of, for example, I was gonna, I guess, follow up by saying, is it still the same thing, or is it a mutation of the first virus or the first wave?
I think we have not purged the first wave. It's probably not the right terminology to call it a second wave. But if, for example, moving forward, if any of you have experienced annual flu shots, you know that every year that vaccine is modified to reflect the mutation of that virus as it travels around the world. And that's exactly what we can anticipate moving forward from this. This will become eventually like the cold or the flu. That as it transmits through human populations, in waves, it will change. It may not change dramatically, but every year we can anticipate that vaccines will address whatever those changes are and try to match the good vaccine with the mutated form of the virus. That's the way we live now with flu viruses.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, and Ken from CB5, I think, has his hand up, and I think that's the last one for now.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Keck, for your comprehensive review. It's greatly appreciated. In talking about how, sorry.
That's okay. I want to tell you that if that was me, my kids say, keep your COVID to yourself. They're very mean. But whenever you cough, people these days get very concerned. So
yeah, as you can see, I'm in solitary. In constructing these statistics,
yeah.
Do you know in our community board and community board 5, community board 4, we have a significant sheltered population?
Mm-hmm.
That although the shelters are nominally in our boards, as you know, people in shelters have been placed in hotels, which may be, and in all probability, are outside of the boards and zip codes. So in constructing the various statistics, how are these people being counted? Are they being counted for the zip codes from where they originated in their shelter of residence? Or are they being counted in the hotels where they're currently residing?
That's a fascinating question because they are nomadic population. It's quite sad. People who live in Brooklyn can be relocated into a shelter in the Bronx simply because there's space. And then, jump around and go all over the place. So we have seen that. We've seen that with how kids are placed in schools when they are part of this population. I can tell you that when it comes to deaths attributed to COVID, the state really does factor that in. If you look on the website and scroll into the data and look at where deaths occurred versus where the person originated, factor that in. For just regular cases, I don't think they do that level of diligence yet. But I can say what's really important is I've mentioned since I began meeting with all of you that there are the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene has these community health profiles. And I can guarantee you that what they generate for 2020 is going to be really fascinating because it will contain a lot of that. And it also really focuses on the social determinants of health, where it tells you that, housing, health statistics, education, pregnancy rate. There's so many interesting pieces of information that are embedded that you can find out a lot. It really is. It gives you an absolute snapshot of what type of communities they are in. So you need to stay tuned for that. Moving forward, I think we will have a lot more data when this year in review happens. But for now, you can find out a plethora of information. I hope all of you take a moment to really look online and use the city and state resources. You will be amazed.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, and I see one more hand raised. Bola go ahead and unmute if you have a question for Nancy. Unless that hand is raised inadvertently.
Or we're on mute.
If you have any trouble there and you do have a question for Nancy, maybe if you drop it in the chat, it could be an alternative. Other than that, I don't see any hands raised at this time.
Thank you very much.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Yeah, we can hear you now.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, this is Dr. Borough. Thank you so much for this presentation, Dr. Nancy.
Thank you.
I'm privileged to be the chair for Board 5. And last month, which is September, we brought in the group from Monty. For full disclosure, I work with Monty Hospital to present the vaccine study. And I'm glad that you enroll and sign up for this study. But my concern and my question to you is that for our community, which is majority brown and black, how do we can you use your medium? And also, this is also being directed to the Borough President's office to promote such an important research like this, especially with coronavirus, COVID-19, which unfortunately affected us most in terms of death rates. And now that the vaccine is being rolled out, I think it's important that what do you think can be done to promote it for Black and Brown to be part of the initial phase of the research? Like, for instance, the one you enrolled in, it's been shown to be more effective in older people, meaning 70 and above, than the one with Pfizer and the other company. So how can we get these out to our folks so that even if the second wave comes in, we will not suffer the same fate that we suffered with the death rate?
I'm so glad that you mentioned a couple of details that I did not, because I know that we've had a long meeting and there were so many excellent presentations and, you know, people's attention wanes. It is true. The thing that is unique, the vaccine Monty is using, it doesn't require the deep freeze. It's stable. It will ultimately cost less too for that reason. And it's been shown to be remarkably effective in older populations. And I think that one of the things that's important is, like, over 90,000 people have been tested with that particular vaccine. And when I enrolled, just prior to me, there were 3 little ladies that came from a church in the Bronx, and they were in the range of from the mid to late 80s. And they signed up. So they got the message that this is an important thing and that you can actually protect yourself in a very robust way. We are trying very hard to be able to do enough education and public outreach with the Bronx neighborhood part of the Department of Health in order to increase health literacy, because that's what matters. If people are able, everyone should make decisions for themselves, but they need good information. And the way to find that, there's barriers for people. Older people do not necessarily go on social media. Some of them call our office because they don't even use a computer. And so we have to find other ways that really are through community-based organizations and faith-based organizations. And I am absolutely thrilled to tell you that in the Bronx, I'm very proud to say that some of our community members and residents of all ages get a lot of their health information, food, healthcare through places that are really community-based, churches and community centers and senior centers. And I think that that is probably the place where the most aggressive kind of messaging about the value of vaccines, why somebody would want to participate, the merits of masking and doing all of the, things that we really have to protect ourselves. I think in answer to your question, we would be happy to promote and support not just one hospital or one vaccine trial, but globally the concept that we all have to approach COVID in an evidence-based way, and that we want to support and be able to help public education through all of these amazing, community-based organizations. That's our goal. The deputy and I, the health and policy team, all of our activities for the whole year have been oriented around really increasing health literacy about disparities and about health issues that are in our communities that specifically are important in the Bronx. And, the answer to the big answer to your question is yes, we will help. We want to do that. I think we feel like it's a public duty to help inform the public of what is happening and what is the good things that are happening, not just the bad things, and where they can get help and information that is accurate and not tainted by, politicizing health. That's what's important here. Thank you so much for allowing me to say that.
Thank you.
All right, so that is it for questions. Deputy?
Yeah, thank you. So we have had a rather a very substantive and comprehensive meeting. So there's a lot of dense information, but this is the place for that. So this is good. Now I'll just open up the meeting floor to any announcements. So this is that part of the program, if you were agenda, where we open it up to agencies and the boards to make announcements about what's going on in their respective boards. And if you could just unmute yourself and actually raise your hand. Raise your hand first, and then unmute yourself when you're called on by Chris. Then we will move forward with that. So, any announcements and any hands raised, Chris?
Not yet. Give people a second here. If you're on the phone, hit *9 to raise your hand. You're just in WebEx software, just hit the button.
I think everybody wants to get started on their Thanksgiving dinners now, right?
All right, still nothing. So
still nothing. Okay, well, we'll take that as no response is good response, and we don't have any questions or announcements. So at this time, we can adjourn the meeting. I again thank everyone.
Deputy, this is Tom. I did raise my hand.
Oh.
I just wanted to remind the boards and the elected officials that, as per the City Planning Commission presentation that we had this morning, that the Borough Board will be voting on this text amendment at its December meeting. So the boards have until our scheduled December meeting, which we'll share the date with you, in order for your boards to vote, so that your chairpersons have the authority to vote at the next Borough Board meeting. And it is also important that the council members come prepared to vote at the next Borough Board meeting as well on the text amendment.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tom. Everyone, so December, as all of our meetings are, will be a very important one, where we will be having to take a vote. So looking forward to seeing everyone, all of the specifically chairs and council members in that portion of our meeting. So and council members, representatives. No more questions, no hands raised, no announcements. I will adjourn the meeting and thank everyone for giving us their time this morning, and have a great day and have a great holiday as well.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Happy holidays, everyone.
And stay safe.
And get tested, please. Everybody get tested.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.